Hello everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, I will walk you through all the important components that is responsible to achieve security in Spring Boot applications. When an end user sends a request or the RESTful client sends a request to our REST application, the very first component in Spring Security that intercepts that request is the authentication filter. Let me open the authentication filter class. Here this is the authentication filter, which is a servlet filter which extends the once per request filter. Here inside this authentication filter we are having the authentication success handler and the failure handler. Let us discuss about those later. See here, the authentication filter is a servlet filter class that will see if the user has authenticated. If not, it will send that request to the authentication manager. For suppose, if we see in the diagram, we are having this authentication manager. The authentication filter is a servlet filter class. This authentication filter is a servlet filter class that will see if the user has authenticated or not. If not, it will send that request to the authentication manager to check if the details sent by the user, are correct or not. The username and password are valid or not. It will check. This authentication manager, let me open the authentication manager class. See here, we are having the authentication manager. It is an interface. Inside this interface, we are having the abstract method so called authenticate. The method is authenticate, which returns the authentication. Here, this authentication manager is an interface which has been implemented by the 5 classes. The authentication manager in turn uses the authentication provider. Let us go into the diagram. This authentication manager uses the authentication provider. This is where it uses the authentication provider. This is where the login logic or the authentication logic is defined. Let me open the authentication provider here. Authentication provider. Here, this is the authentication provider interface. Inside this, we are having the authenticate method. This authentication provider will not fetch the user details from database, LDAP or in-memory database. What this will do is, it will use user details service for that purpose. This authentication purpose will not fetch the details from the database directly. What this will do is, it will use the user details service. See here, this has been implemented by these many classes. Let me open the abstract details authentication provider. Inside this abstract user details authentication provider, this class, which is an abstract class, has been extended by the DAO authentication provider. Inside this DAO authentication provider, we are having the user details service which has been implemented. Inside this user details service is an interface. If we implement this interface, by default we will get the load user by username method. This load user by username method, by using this, we can fetch the username from the database by using this. In turn, this will return the user details, complete user details. So it will use this user detail service for that purpose. It also uses a password encoder. It also uses a password encoder because we don't want to store the passwords in plain text. The incoming password from the user will be encoded like bcrypt password encoder. So we will not store the password as a plain text in the database. So what we will do is we will encrypt the password by using the bcrypt password encoder, and then the comparison is done. Once the authentication provider checks if the authentication details, that is the username, password are correct, then it will send the appropriate response back to the authentication manager. Then the authentication manager hands it back to the authentication filter. It will hand it back to the authentication filter. If the user details are okay, authentication is succeeded. The authentication filter uses authentication success handler. See here, this authentication filter uses the authentication success handler. It will uses this authentication success handler. Inside it we are having the default method, which is on authentication success. So it is using the do filter, in which it processes the request and the response. This authentication filter uses the authentication success handler and stores the authentication information in an instance of security context, where security context is an interface which has been implemented by the security context holder, which is a class inside the so we can store the authentication object inside the security context holder, which is username and password. If the authentication fails, what it will do is, if the authentication fails, it will use the authentication failure handler. Inside it we are having the on authentication failure abstract method. It will use the authentication failure handler to send the appropriate response back to the client. In this way, these are the main components in the Spring Security which are being used completely, which is authentication filter, authentication manager, authentication provider, user detail service, all these things. Thank you.